In this video, I'm going to be talking about the basic research on religion and marriage to help us better understand spirituality and religious types of couple therapy. So the first thing that I want to say is just overall, couples that are religious tend to be more satisfied. So it doesn't really matter what type of religion really. Whenever they look at religiosity, you tend to have a correlation, not a high correlation, but somewhat of a correlation between religiosity and relationship satisfaction. Why is that so? That's the more interesting question. So there's a series of studies that try to get at that and kind of pick at that a little bit. One of them is that couples who are religious tend to demonstrate more conflict skills. So they tend to be able to address their conflict in a more healthy way in general. They tend to be a little bit more satisfied, especially if they agree on their understanding of their faith and if they have a similar level of commitment. So if they're both highly committed, they do well. If they're both moderate, they do well. If they're both low, actually, they also do well. You sometimes get issues when you have someone who is low commitment and the partner is high commitment. That can cause some conflict. Or if you get people who have very different understandings of what spirituality means, you can get some conflict. Couple prayer is another area that couples who are religious tend to do well. And couple prayer tends to predict levels of trust in the relationship. So there's a series of research by Beach and Fincham that's looked at prayer, and they have found that couples who pray blessings on each other tend to have more trust in their relationship. So it's more than just a positive interaction, too. So they had an alternate group that just did positive interactions with each other, and then a group that did actual blessing prayers for each other, and they found a significant difference between the two groups. So it's a great study to be able to understand religious couples. Another thing that we have looked at and researchers have looked at and tried to understand is how do couples work together and address their religion together. And so there's a study that looked at joint religious communication, and it seemed that couples who talked about their faith had that joint religious communication. And it may be simple things, talking about things going on in their church or synagogue, and it may be more complicated things like personal spiritual struggle and strivings. But the couples that talked to each other and had this joint religious communication, they did better. So there seems to be something going on with this joint religious communication that's important. Another thing that's really common in Western culture is a view of marriage that is mixed. So Western culture is a conglomeration of Judeo-Christian tradition and Greco-Roman traditions. And from the Judeo-Christian tradition, you get a view of marriage as a covenant. So people who see their marriage as covenantal, they believe that they should sacrifice for their marriage. They believe that they will reach marital goals as a high goal in their life, and they expect everybody else to be doing the same thing. So both partners in their marriage, and as well as their friends and family, will do things and make sacrifices to have a healthy and good marriage. From the other side, in the Greco-Roman tradition, you have a more individualistic, and from the English tradition. And so individualistic people would see their marriage in terms of, my marriage is a way for me to grow personally. It's a way for me to meet my individual goals in life, is to become married. And so these are two very different ways of seeing marriage, influenced by religion and faith. And no couple is ever going to come into a therapy office and say, hey, one of us is covenantal and the other one is more individualistic, and that's our problem. But I think if we understand the underlying research around that, and we understand the underlying sociological influences, then we can get a better understanding ourselves of what might be happening when they talk about what their goals are for their relationship. Now, lots of couples that come in for couple therapy, they're individualistically focused because they're hurt and they're in pain and they have their walls up. But if you can listen to the underlying kind of master goals, like the eventual goals of their relationship, and begin to see whether or not they have a high goal of a healthy relationship and that they expect some sacrifice for that, and they expect to invest their life in having a healthy marriage and family life, then you begin to see what their level of valuing is, and the level of seeing the relationship as covenantal. The more religious a couple is, the more likely they are to be covenantal, and particularly Judeo-Christian traditions. Another area to understand is changes sociologically in terms of cohabitation. So there's been a very quick shift in about the last 25 years where the majority of couples now cohabitate before marriage, and that didn't happen even 25 years ago. So this is an interesting shift because religious organizations and religious communities have a tendency to encourage decisional, community-based activity. So when a couple gets engaged, it's announced and everyone is aware of it, right? And they pay attention to it. When a couple gets married, this is a public declaration. The religious community and the spiritual community will encourage it. It usually happens in the church or synagogue or in the community itself. And there's kind of all these traditions and activities that happen that make a public declaration of this is what's happening in our relationship. That's kind of an old way, a traditional way of people becoming a married couple. In our current society, and this is in most Western societies today, and definitely in the USA, people kind of do what Scott Stanley at University of Denver calls sliding into marriage. So they talk about their relationship maybe a little bit, and then they decide to live together, but they haven't necessarily had the conversation about whether or not they are a permanent couple before they live together. They'll often live together in a way that will just be testing the waters, or it's for now. Just like you might date someone for now without really making a lifelong commitment that this is the person you're going to be with. So you often will see people in couple therapy, whether they're cohabitating or they have married, who kind of slid into the decision, right? They kind of slide slowly into the decision and they move in together, and then they start to have a lot of things in common, and they get a mortgage together, and oops, we have a baby. Okay, now we have children together. And so they slide into this, and before they know it, they've decided to get married, but they never really stop to make an intentional decision and have intentional activities with the people that care about them and love them to make decisions. Now we're engaged, now we're married, and do the decisional purpose. So this can be a more risky way for a couple to get married with each other, and they may need to go back and have some good decisions about what it is that drew them together and holds them together today, or if they're not married, about whether or not they should stay together. Religion can also be a wedge issue. You sometimes get partners with different values and beliefs, as I talked about with cohabitation or with covenantal values for marriage, and this can be an underlying wedge between them where, we hope that religion would pull people together, but sometimes that can actually pull them apart from each other. So they have to create kind of zones of living where they don't talk about, or they don't at least bond over issues of spirituality and religion because they have different ideas about it. They can bond in other ways in their life, and that's important for them to do, but they're lacking the ability to bond and connect with each other strongly in their spirituality. Another one is spiritual one-upmanship. So you sometimes see this particularly in couples therapy, and one partner will come in and say, I really want this partner to be more like God wants them to be. They need to be a more godly woman or a godly man, and I wish that were so, and they'll criticize the person, and they're essentially saying it's me and God against you, right? And they're triangulating against their partner and saying they're not good enough. And even sometimes in a contemptuous way. And this can be really toxic for a couple. And so one of the things to understand is the research on this does show that this is quite negative and a bad predictor for the future of their relationship. Finally, church communities are usually healthy and supportive, but they're not always. And so sometimes in my couples lab, we've seen some unhealthy things happen where people in the church take sides with one partner and kind of turn against the other one, labeling them as a bad husband or a bad wife. And this can be really difficult and toxic to the relationship. You also sometimes get other relationships that people start in kind of unhealthy ways where they are attracted to someone in their community and see it as healthy and a good thing when actually it's a threat to their relationship to get in an unhealthy relationship with others. So also sometimes confidentiality for problems is another issue within churches where people will share things with a small group leader or a pastor, and then that information will get around and it will hurt the marriage or the family. So these are all kinds of basic issues that can pop up when addressing spirituality in the relationships that the couples work with. So in my next video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ethics of doing couple therapy when addressing spiritual issues. Thank you.